Hello and welcome. Thank you all for being here today. I'm Nick Knoke, Director of Technology for the Asset Leadership Network, and I am excited for a conversation with Jon Shelness, President of My Property ID Registry. Before we get underway, we just want to thank ALN patron members, including Jacobs, Definitive Logic, Onuma, ABS Quality Evaluations, and CPI. Also our organizational members, especially My Property ID Registry, but all our organizational members. And if you're out there wondering how you'd like to work with us, please reach out so we can talk more. And with that, I'll just say next week we'll have a program, but 2 weeks from now we know is going to be Jack Dempsey. So we're just promoting that one to start now. So that'll be February 29th. And with that, I will say if you're out there watching, please send any comments, questions, or feedback to the chat. Or you can use the Q&A function to put your questions to Jon or Mike or I. Mike Bordenero, Executive Director, welcome.
Great, thank you, Nick. How are things in Lander, Wyoming today?
Balmy. Well, good for winter for sure.
What does balmy mean in Lander, Wyoming, February?
You know, the sun's peeking out and it's above freezing.
Oh, it's above freezing. That is balmy in February.
Yeah.
So I am in St. Louis, which is even balmier, and Jon is joining us from Des Moines, Iowa. How you doing, Jon?
Well, I'm doing very well, thank you.
Jon has been a long-term supporter of the ALN, and he has a very specific area of asset management he's interested in, and I've been fascinated in learning about the details of it. So I know that it's going to be an interesting discussion today. But before we get into issues of the difference between tracking and traceability and web capabilities, can you give us a little background on how you got to this point in your asset management journey?
Sure. So I sometimes think I have one of the more oddball histories. I have a criminal justice background, and I've been working with court-ordered youth for many years. And without thinking about it much, most every single youth that I worked with was convicted or had crimes charged against them for property thefts, for burglary or theft. And I was in a graduate class where our instructor started talking about crime prevention tactics. And crime prevention are things that join citizens to the police department to help solve crimes. And there are two that everybody knows: Neighborhood Watch and 911. Some of you may have heard of National Night Out, but there's another one called Operation Identification, which is a strategy the police developed to encourage residents and homeowners to mark their property, so if it's recovered by the police, they can trace it back to the rightful owner and use it as evidence in a court case. And in doing research on Operation Identification, I realized that it had never been modernized for the internet age. And then I began expanding on that understanding and realizing that larger institutions are also behind the times when it comes to tracing. They identify their property, but tracing is more difficult. And I joined the National Property Management Association and wrote some articles for them and have given talks, and then also joined the ALN and just wanting to be a contributing member and educate more about how tracing works.
Well, it's not that odd, Jon. Everybody has got to asset management a different way, and that is it clearly identifies why you are focused on reclaiming lost and stolen property. But I think the principles that you're talking about apply to more than just homeowners and individuals. I think that the issues of clarifying the difference between tracing and tracking are going to be very beneficial to organizations. And as we've discussed, the issues with asset management are challenging to people. These are kind of new concepts, but we're at an age in humanity where there's always going to be new concepts coming out. That's just going to be the explosion of tools being created. And it's up to us as leaders to try to figure out the ways to guide our organizations to use the tools to create the greatest value and benefits. And often terminology in this new world is a key issue to overcome. And you helped me understand the difference between tracing and tracking. And can you very quickly just say what tracing is and what tracking is, and then we'll go on to discuss how to trace things better.
Sure. So tracking and tracing were used interchangeably long before the computer age. If you watch an old Western, they'll track an animal or they'll track an outlaw. But in the age of the computer, tracking and tracing have become very different things. And what tracking is in the modern age is where a transponder of some sort, either using GPS or Wi-Fi or cell towers, is affixed to an item, and that can be watched on a computer screen. So this would include LoJack or Tile or AirTag. Tracing is what departments of motor vehicles do with license plates and VIN numbers. It's also when an airline puts a luggage tag with a barcode on it, that's not a tracker, that's a tracer. And similarly, UPS and FedEx, they trace their property through their supply chain. And tracing is also what the police use to identify guns that have been used in crimes, and there are other uses for it too. So it's really like a mapping. It's more like a way of mapping the path that something took. So think of a library. You go to a library, look up a book. There's a path between the card catalog and the book, and that's what tracing is.
So then how can organizations jump this leap if they're doing one but want to start moving into the tracing?
So right now, the way large institutions mark property with asset tags, those are for internal use. That is, if a laptop is found in a filing cabinet within an organization, it can be identified and you know the office to go to figure out who it belongs to. But if a piece of property goes off grounds, if it's left at the airport, or if it's broken in, if that laptop is stolen from a car, that identifying asset tag cannot be used for tracing purposes. There has to be an alphanumeric string with information about how to get it back to the rightful owner. Now, in the old days, they might have used an 800 number on an asset tag, or maybe the address of a location, but we live in a global society, and the best way to do that now is with a URL.
Okay. I was going to try to share my screen to show one of these URLs, but I'm having technical difficulties. So one thing many people are familiar with are the QR codes now, and the image that Jon had sent me that I'm not able to show. So it shows a barcode with the property identifier, but then there's also a QR code that says, if you find this, contact us. And it has a mechanism for getting in touch with the owning organization. And that's the simple solution, if I understand things correctly. Is that right, John?
Well, I think that you might be mistaking QR code. A QR code is a machine readable tag that you need a piece of software on your cell phone to read. Human readability is the key. So it is a URL. It could be any URL, and then it's followed by the word return. And then agencies or institutions create a web page with that matching URL. And then the finder of a piece of lost or stolen property, whether it's a police department or a Good Samaritan, can enter that number onto the web page that's on the asset tag and hit submit. And the way the back end is designed is it will send an email to the administrator of that piece of property and let them know that it's been recovered.
Okay, well, thank you for making that clear. Um, what you just described is based on an international standard. Can you tell us about the international standards that helped you establish what you just said?
Sure. So there is an organization called the Loss Prevention Certification Board. They're based in the UK. They are now in the United States, but they're primarily everywhere else in the world, every major industrial nation. And with the age of the internet, they came up with two standards. One is how a back end should be reachable by the internet for keeping a record in a database of the make, model, and serial number of an item. And then it's also corresponding asset tag number. And then the other standard is how to design the asset tag so it can be repatriated back to the rightful owner.
Okay. And you say that they're in the US now, but is the US adopting LPS, Loss Prevention Standard 1224 and 1225?
So as we mentioned at the beginning, I have a small business that helps individuals and small businesses, and so my familiarity with this is organizations that use these strategies. They're almost all overseas, and they're very small companies themselves. Now, the one place that has adopted these strategies without maybe even understanding that there are standards is the way DMVs work and the way police departments connect with DMVs to trace motor vehicles.
Okay, can you tell us how that goes?
Sure, hold on one second. So we really take for granted the way a DMV works or the way the police trace license plates. It's the most effective tool that the police have. The vast majority of crimes are solved because of license plates and VIN numbers. And in some police cars, depending on the status of the police officer, they might have optical character recognition software and a hardware in the grill of their car. When they roll up on a car and put their squad car into park, by the time they look at their computer monitor, the make, model, VIN number, the owner, the color of the vehicle, all of that is on their monitor. And we haven't
So
talked.
that is the connection to the web that you were talking about and advise organizations to follow, because that gives them the real-time access to information and direct traceability of the property.
That is correct. It's a little bit different than the way a DMV works because it's a closed system and it has to do with law enforcement. But the strategies that are captured in LPS 1224 and LPS 1225, those are loss prevention standards, give private organizations and large institutions a leg up in improving the probability that they will recover lost and stolen property. So we're talking about just giving everybody an edge in getting property back.
So ISO 55001 ends with having continuous improvement as part of your asset management system. And while many people have tracking numbers for all of their personal property, jumping up to having a way for these to be returned via an internet approach would be a continual improvement to their asset management system.
Yes, and again, I'd like to just clarify, because we tend to use these words, tracking and tracing. An asset tag currently at any institution is an identifier. And it's not for tracking purposes. We may say in a common vernacular that we're tracking a package, but it's really a tracer. And I think, for argument's sake, within our organization, it's an important distinction that we should just substitute one for the other when we're thinking about that.
Okay. But you've been talking about police systems, but then there are the large federal agencies, and states have all their personal property. Is there an approach that you would recommend if you were czar for the day and could magically help all organizations improve? What would you have them do?
Well, I don't know whether Nick has received that email or not from you, Mike, where he could put up that sample of the National Institutes of Health asset tag.
His daughter got sick at school and he had to go get her, so he's not available. And I've tried to do the sheet. Let me try it. I'll risk.
Well, it's okay. Let me just describe right now how it would be done. So whether you have an asset tag that says property of Google with a number on it, or whether you have an asset tag that says property of NIH with a number on it. Yeah, there we go. That asset tag is merely identifiable. So as a challenge to any of you listening to this, I would challenge you to actually figure out a way to contact Google and tell them that you have found a piece of their property and you'd like to return it to them. So it's really virtually impossible to do that. And I would say it might be the same with the NIH. In the case of the NIH tag, it just says NIH, and most people wouldn't even know what that is. So what I'm encouraging institutions to do is to beef up their asset tags. So in the case of the NIH, it would say there would be a URL, nih.gov. It could even say on the asset tag, National Institutes of Health. And then it would say, if you find this item, go to this URL. And in the case of the NIH, that would be nih.gov/return. And then, as you can see there is a website that doesn't tell the sender anything about the property. So there's just an entry point where you would put in the number of the asset tag and hit submit. And then typically what happens is another page comes up and says, could you please give us some information about this piece of property? Who are you? Do you have a phone number? Where is the piece of property? Can you give us any information? And then when the information is submitted, now there is a privacy protected way for the rightful owner of the property to connect with the person who's submitting the information. And this is not all that dissimilar to the way Craigslist works or Facebook Marketplace or anything like that. But now, for instance, if a laptop is left at TSA by an absent-minded researcher from the NIH, the asset tag will tell an official at the TSA how to return it. Otherwise, the TSA doesn't know what to do with it. They know it's a piece of property that belongs to the NIH, but they can't return it. And so this gives, again, just a incremental opportunity to get lost and stolen property returned.
So it's more than just beefing up the tag. It's also establishing the web system to allow the TAC to have the property be returned. So there's technical work in addition to redesigning a tag.
Correct. It's though in the age of the internet, if you think of a contact page on a website, that's all this really is. But instead of just simply entering your name and contact information, you're also putting in that number. And with a few code corrections, that number becomes traceable inside of the database that is that the company owns. Not particularly complicated.
Okay. So there's another issue here. So many organizations have insurance and actually don't pay a lot of attention to their lost and stolen property. But in the case of the United States government, which is combined, made up of many combined large organizations, there can be hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars, in lost or misplaced property on an annual basis.
Yes, so there is a little bit of a disconnect there because it's a common refrain when I talk to people about this. It's not a big deal. We have our laptop coded in such a way that it can't be cracked, and we just can. It was a couple of years old anyway, and it's just a paperweight, and we don't care. We'll just put it into insurance, or we'll just swallow the cost. So two responses to that. The first one is the person who stole that computer is now going to look for computers elsewhere. And I think that we kind of owe it to society that we collectively, people who are law-abiding citizens, collectively take small steps that can help reduce property crimes. Property crimes in the United States are the most commonly committed and the least solved crimes in America. Let me say that again. It's the most commonly committed and least solved crime in America. And the reason is that criminals know that the property can't be traced. Now, at the federal level and state level, and even at the local level, if you're receiving a government grant, you are obligated under regulatory provisions to be using the most available, the best and smartest available tech for your property. But that message is just drowned out in all of the other things that we hear and see coming from the federal government. And then the last point I want to make, Mike, is that related to the insurance issue is that it's thought that only about 50% of people who are victims of crimes file a police report. And the police really have a great need. Even if you don't want that property back, they want the make, model, serial number, and the asset tag number on that property so they can enter it into their global databases to solve crimes.
Yeah, so there's multiple benefits, and like you've been saying, incremental. People have tags already. If they're just take one more step and have a web-based process for returning lost and stolen property, there'll be considerable benefits, especially to large organizations. There is also the case that you might be able to reduce your insurance, or at least keep your insurance steady, by showing that you have a responsible method for dealing with lost and stolen property.
Yes, that's very correct. And all large institutions the world round use asset management. They tag their property and they keep a record of the make, model, and serial number in a centralized database. There is a reason for that. That's because as a company gets to be a certain size, now asset management companies like IBM and Amazon and there's others out there, they start approaching these companies and saying, you've reached the critical mass now where you can justify an asset management strategy. And the technology that I'm talking about, or the methodologies that I'm talking about, make it easy for smaller companies to just become DIY asset managers. You don't need to have a specially trained employee that uses the database management strategies that IBM sells. You can manage your own databases by using this methodology. And again, when it comes back to my product, the idea is it's for the very smallest players.
But the concepts that you have apply to everyone. And
Applies to yeah.
why don't you say your website, because you do have the ability for people to sample what you're talking about.
Sure. So again, when I started the business, I was just focusing on this strategy the police developed called Operation Identification, which is designed for individuals, homeowners, and small businesses to protect their property against the most common crime, burglary and theft. And so it was actually over a year before I began realizing that this could be applied to larger institutions. So my website is very simply mypropertyidregistry.com. And by the way, my email is Jon, Jon, at mypropertyidregistry.com. And the website doesn't really tell you all that much about how the strategy works. But if you look at my blog posts, you'll see things there. And the last thing is, if there are people listening who are ALN members, you're welcome to email me and I'll give you a promo code for a free sample. And you can look at how my miniaturized version of enterprise asset management works.
Excellent. That's a good pilot approach, something that people can do. So really appreciate this insight on tracking and tracing the difference and what can be done for people to continually improve their asset management journey. So typically I would have Nick come in and show our closing slides at this point. But since I'm having technical difficulties, we're not going to do that. We'll let you have last word, Jon. Anything you want to say that I didn't ask you about?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate the opportunity to speak, to introduce myself to members, and to just explain that tracing, tracking, and identification are different, that we have a kind of civil responsibility to protect our assets, and if something is stolen, to report it to the police, and that the technology is out there. It's just about educating ourselves about it and implementing it.
Excellent. So thank you very much for sharing all that. Boy, you're getting compliments in the chat there. So people are resonating with what you said, and we thank you. We thank the audience, and we'll see you again next week. Bye for now, everyone.